Between 1851 and 1901 in Victorian England, over 2.5 million women were classified as spinsters, facing societal scorn, limited opportunities, and a desperate struggle for independence. With 500,000 more women than men in Britain, many had no chance of marriage, forcing them to navigate a world designed to exclude them. Here's what life was really like for a Victorian spinster. Hey, quick thing before we start. If you actually listen to these regularly, hit like or subscribe. I always wonder where everyone's at, so comment your city and what time it is. Weird to think some of you are having breakfast in London while I'm recording this at night here in the States. Alright, let's head back to Victorian England. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously. Adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket, because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. The room is cold. Not like, oh, I should put on a sweater cold. I mean the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and sets up camp there. Your eyes flutter open to darkness, save for the faint grey light filtering through thin curtains. It's 5 a.m. on a January morning in London 1862, and the boarding house room you call home feels like an icebox. You're 25 years old, and according to society, you're officially a spinster. How fun. Miss Harrington, are you awake? The sharp voice of Mrs. Wilson, your landlady, pierces through the door. The fire needs lighting downstairs. We have guests arriving at 8. There's no such thing as hitting snooze when you're a spinster living in someone else's home. The floorboards sting your bare feet like tiny knives as you slide them from beneath the thin blanket. Unlike your warm bed right now, Victorian bedding was, let's just say, minimal if you weren't wealthy. Coming, Mrs. Wilson, you call back, your voice still thick with sleep. So here's the thing about being a spinster in Victorian England. It wasn't just about being unmarried. It was a whole identity that society dumped on you, and it happened way earlier than you might think. You might be picturing some grey-haired lady with cats, right? Nope. By age 25, sometimes even younger, unmarried women were already being labelled as spinsters, just sitting there at a family dinner while relatives discuss your marriage prospects like you're not even there. What's wrong with Elizabeth? Why hasn't she secured a husband yet? Thanks, Aunt Margaret. I'm literally right here. The mirror on your dresser, cracked in one corner, reflects a young woman who looks nothing like the desperate, withered creature society imagines when they hear spinster. But that doesn't matter. Once you hit your mid-20s without a wedding ring, the transformation was complete in everyone else's eyes. You reach for your dress, the same one you wore yesterday and the day before. When you're working as a live-in assistant at a boarding house, you don't exactly have an extensive wardrobe, just 3 serviceable dresses that you wash by hand every Sunday. Your hair gets twisted up into a tight bun. No fashionable curls or elaborate styles for working women. Practicality rules everything about your appearance now. Miss Harrington. The voice is more insistent this time. For one moment, you call back, pinning the last strand of hair in place. Okay, so why were there so many spinsters in Victorian England? Well, for one thing, math was not on women's side. The 1851 census showed there were about 500,000 more women than men in Britain, and 2.5 million unmarried women total. That's not a small number. Men were dying in wars, workplace accidents and diseases at higher rates, plus a bunch of guys were shipping off to the colonies looking for fortune, so it wasn't like all these women were unmarriageable monsters. There simply weren't enough men to go around. Think about it. If musical chairs had 500,000 more players than chairs, you wouldn't blame the people left standing, would you? You hurry down the narrow servants' staircase, the wooden steps creaking beneath your feet. The boarding house is still mostly silent, its occupants enjoying their final hours of sleep. But for you, the day begins in darkness and ends long after the sun has set. I spent way too long researching Victorian boarding houses for this, by the way, like concerningly long. These weren't the friendly, quirky places you see in movies. They were often dreary, crowded, and offered little privacy. Lower-end ones were downright dangerous, while the slightly better ones, like where you're staying, were just soul-crushingly bland. The kitchen is at least warmer than your room, thanks to the banked coals in the stove from the night before. You get to work immediately, stoking the fire and adding coal. Your hands are already chapped and red from constant exposure to water, soap, and the biting cold. Your stomach growls, reminding you that yesterday's dinner was meagre at best, a thin soup and a chunk of bread. But breakfast won't happen until after the morning chores are done. Mrs. Wilson is strict about the schedule. "There you are," Mrs. Wilson says, appearing in the doorway like a disapproving ghost. "The dining room needs sweeping, and the front parlour fire should be lit next. Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton will be expecting tea when they come down at 7. She's not cruel, exactly, just businesslike. When you're employing a spinster to help run your boarding house, there's no need for warmth or familiarity. It's a transaction. You work, you get a room and meals. "Yes, Mrs. Wilson," you say, keeping your eyes down. "See, the whole unmarried woman living alone thing? Not really an option in Victorian times. Respectable spinsters couldn't just rent an apartment and live their best single lives. Society literally wouldn't allow it. Spinsters typically either lived with family, if they were lucky enough to have family who would take them in, or found positions as governesses, companions, or, like you, assistants in businesses like boarding houses. The alternative was, well, the workhouse, and nobody wanted to end up in the workhouse. Victorian workhouses were basically prisons for the poor, where you'd do brutal labour for barely enough food to survive. Your second cousin ended up in one after her parents died, and the last letter you received from her described conditions that still give you nightmares. So, here you are, 25, unmarried, working for room and board in a boarding house that caters to travellers and long-term residents of modest means. Your room is tiny, your possessions few, but you're not in the workhouse. That counts for something. As you sweep the dining room, your mind wanders to how you ended up here. Your father was a clerk in a small firm, providing a respectable but modest living for your family. When he died of pneumonia 6 years ago, everything changed. Your mother took in sewing, but it wasn't enough. Your brother James was apprenticed to a printer, and well, you had expected to be married by then. That was the plan every girl was supposed to have. But the suitable young men in your social circle were few, and none had shown particular interest before your father died. After his death, when your family's circumstances declined, your prospects dried up completely. There's this wild misconception that Victorian women never worked before they had to, but that's just not true. Even in the mid-1800s, about 30 to 40% of women contributed significantly to their household income. It's just that the census takers often didn't record it properly. They'd list a woman's marital status, single, married or widowed, but not always her employment. And smaller jobs like helping with a family business or part-time work weren't considered important enough to document. But by the 1850s, more women than ever were working outside the home. In fact, female employment was higher then than any other time until after World War II. That's a history fact that gets weirdly overlooked. You finish sweeping and move to the parlour to prepare the fire. Your knees ache from the previous day's scrubbing, but you ignore the pain. Pain is a luxury you can't afford to acknowledge when there's work to be done. The Pembertons are regular guests, travelling salespeople who stay at the boarding house every other month. Mrs. Pemberton always looks at you with a mixture of pity and smugness, the look of a married woman regarding a spinster. Such a shame, you once overheard her tell her husband. Not unattractive, but so plain. No wonder she never caught a husband. You hadn't known whether to laugh or cry, as if catching a husband was like trapping a rabbit, a matter of skill rather than circumstance, as if your father's death and your family's subsequent financial struggles hadn't made you practically invisible to eligible men. The fire catches, and you feed it carefully, adding coal bit by bit. Heat begins to radiate outward, warming your frozen fingers. You allow yourself 30 seconds of this luxury before standing to set out the tea things. Now, here's something interesting. Around the mid-19th century, there was a big shift in how people thought about marriage. It used to be primarily a business transaction, a way to share wealth and connections between families, but by the early 1800s, there was more emphasis on marrying for love. This actually made things harder in some ways. Women were still taught that marriage was their ultimate goal, but now it had to be a love match. And when you combine that with women's lack of legal rights, like they couldn't own property or vote, suddenly the pressure wasn't just to find a man, but to find the perfect man. You needed someone you loved, who could support you financially, and who would respect your autonomy within the marriage. That's a pretty tall order, especially when the pickings were slim to begin with. So many women just decided they'd rather not marry at all than end up with the wrong person. In an 1889 magazine called Titbits, I swear that's the real name, women wrote in explaining why they chose to be spinsters, and their answers were amazing. One woman wrote that if she got married, she'd have to be a wife, mother, nurse, housekeeper, chambermaid, seamstress, dairymaid, and scrub, generally. As just a dairymaid, she only had one job to do. Another said marriage was like an electric battery. When you once join hands, you can't let go, however much it hurts. And my personal favourite, from a Miss Sparrow, who said she didn't want to enlarge my menagerie of pets because she found the animal man less docile than a dog, less affectionate than a cat, and less amusing than a monkey. Damn, Miss Sparrow, tell us how you really feel. By 7 o'clock, the house is stirring to life. The Pembertons come down to the parlour and you serve them tea with hands that don't tremble, despite your exhaustion. Your stomach is still empty, but you've grown accustomed to hunger as a constant companion. "Thank you, girl," Mr. Pemberton says without looking at you. You're 25, hardly a girl, but invisible people don't get to correct their betters. "Will there be anything else, sir?" you ask, your voice the perfect blend of civility and efficiency. "No, that will be all for now." You return to the kitchen where Mrs. Wilson allows you a cup of tea and a slice of bread with a scraping of butter. It's not much, but it's something. The other girl who works here, Annie, a maid of 16, joins you briefly. "Morning, Miss Harrington," she says with a cheerfulness that feels foreign to you now. "Cold one today, innit?" "Indeed," you reply, sipping your tea to warm your insides. "Have you done the upstairs rooms yet?" "Just about to start. Mrs. Thompson in room 4 wants her fire lit first thing. Says her rheumatism is acting up something fierce." You nod. Mrs. Thompson is a widow who's lived at the boarding house for 3 years. Her small widow's pension allows her this modest accommodation, but little else. In some ways, her position is even more precarious than yours. At least you're young enough to work. She's at the mercy of her late husband's pension administrator. Now, I should point out that this whole choosing to be a spinster thing was mainly a white middle-class luxury. Working-class women and women of colour rarely had the option to just decide not to marry if they didn't want to. If their families couldn't support them, they were pretty much out of luck. But with the shortage of men, spinsters were becoming more common across all social classes, and society was freaking out about what to do with all these single ladies. In 1869, an English essayist named William Rathbone Gregg published a work titled "Why Are Women Redundant?" Yes, redundant, like extra office furniture. It was a 40-page essay about his concerns over all these superfluous women cluttering up society, and his solution: ship them all off to the British colonies to become wives for the lonely settlers there. That way, he figured, the population would be more evenly balanced in both places. Small problem though, how exactly do you transport hundreds of thousands of women across the Atlantic? Also, a lot of these spinsters were from middle or upper class families. You can't just force them onto a boat. After your brief breakfast, it's back to work. The morning is a blur of cleaning, serving and catering to the needs of the boarders. By noon, your back aches and your feet throb, but there's no time to rest. The other boarders begin to emerge from their rooms: a retired schoolmaster, a clerk, two elderly sisters who share a room to save on costs, and a young man studying law. They barely notice you as you clear dishes, refill teapots, and stoke fires. This is your life now. Invisible, essential but unseen, the perfect Victorian spinster, useful but unobtrusive, present but not acknowledged. But as you work, your mind is far from dormant. You've been saving. 3 shillings tucked away in a small cloth bag hidden beneath a loose floorboard in your room. It's not much, but it's something that belongs solely to you. Because here's what society didn't quite understand yet. Being a spinster wasn't always a failure or a tragedy. Sometimes it was a choice. Sometimes it was an opportunity. The woman question, that's what they called it in Victorian times. It wasn't one specific question, but rather a term used for any issue related to women's education, healthcare, voting rights, and proper gender roles. And with all these spinsters popping up, it became more relevant than ever. By the mid-19th century, early feminist groups were using the spinster problem to push for solutions that benefited all women. Their main goal: better education, especially for middle-class women who didn't have family wealth to fall back on and weren't able to work in domestic service due to social restrictions. By the 1870s, several colleges for women had opened in England, like Newman College and Somerville College. Some legacy institutions even started allowing small numbers of women to study there, though they were barred from taking final examinations, which meant they did all the same work as their male classmates but didn't get a degree at the end, because of course. Still, the push for women's education was largely successful, and by the late 1800s, single women suddenly had more options than ever before. As evening approaches, you find a rare moment of solitude in the small back garden where the laundry is hung to dry. The winter air is sharp in your lungs, but the break from the stuffiness of the house is welcome. You pull a small, worn book from your pocket, a cheap edition of poems you purchased with a few precious pennies saved over months. Reading is your escape, your window into worlds beyond the boarding house walls. Miss Harrington, Mrs. Wilson's voice cuts through your momentary peace. Dinner needs serving. You tuck the book away hastily. Coming, Mrs. Wilson. As you hurry back inside, you pass a mirror in the hallway and catch a glimpse of yourself, back straight, face composed, eyes forward. Not the desperate, pitiful creature the word spinster conjures, but a woman standing on her own 2 feet in a world that never expected her to. And in that moment, in spite of everything, you feel something like pride. Look, Victorian England wasn't exactly a paradise for women, but it wasn't as simple as the stories make it seem either. By the late 1800s, women were pushing boundaries, creating opportunities, and redefining what it meant to be female in a society that tried to keep them in very narrow boxes. And spinsters, they were at the forefront of this quiet revolution. Women who, by choice or by circumstance, lived lives that didn't revolve around husbands and children. Women who found other paths, other purposes, other ways to make their mark. Tonight, as you sink into your bed, exhausted from another long day, you think about the 3 shillings hidden beneath the floorboard and the advertisement you saw in the newspaper last week for a new millinery shop opening on the other side of the city. They're looking for apprentices. Women to learn the trade of hat making. It doesn't pay much at first, but a skilled milliner can eventually earn a decent living, enough perhaps for a small room of one's own. It's a risk, a terrifying leap into the unknown, but as you drift towards sleep, you find yourself calculating how many more shillings you need before you can afford to take that chance, to step out of invisibility and into a life of your own making. Because that's what being a spinster in Victorian England could mean. Not just the absence of a husband, but the presence of possibility. A different kind of life than the one society prescribed. Difficult, yes. Lonely, sometimes. But also, in its way, free. Unlike your warm, comfortable bed tonight, sleep for a Victorian spinster was often just another form of work, gathering strength for the battles of tomorrow. And there would always be battles, but also, increasingly, victories. As you slip into dreams, you don't know it yet, but you're part of something bigger than yourself, a quiet revolution of women who, for countless different reasons, found themselves outside the traditional path and decided to forge new ones instead. Your story is just beginning, and in the darkness of Victorian London, that's both a terrifying and an exhilarating thought. You wake to a sliver of grey light cutting through your curtains. Another day at the boarding house, another day of Mrs. Wilson's sharp commands, another day of invisibility, but something's different this morning. The advertisement you tore from the newspaper is still clutched in your hand, creased from being folded and unfolded dozens of times. Apprentices wanted, Madame Beaumont's millinery, previous experience not required, inquire within. The pay would be meagre at first. Apprentices earn almost nothing, but a skilled milliner could eventually make enough to rent a room of her own, to be independent. 3 shillings saved, 7 more needed for the first month's rent on the cheapest room you could find, then food, then fabric for a new dress that doesn't scream boarding house assistant. Your fingers trace the words on the paper. Is this madness? Respectable women don't just leave, not without family to go to, not without a husband waiting. Miss Harrington, Mrs. Wilson's voice shatters your thoughts. The breakfast needs preparing. You tuck the advertisement into your pocket and swing your legs over the side of the bed. Dreams are for night time. The day belongs to duty. So here's a fun thing about Victorian working women that nobody talks about. They actually had access to more jobs than people realise. Not great jobs, mind you. We're not talking CEO positions. But by the 1850s, the number of women in the workforce had seriously expanded. Textiles was a big industry for women, with jobs in everything from spinning yarn to making hats. Factory work was plentiful but brutal, dangerous conditions, terrible pay, and the kind of hours that'd make an Amazon warehouse manager blush. But sewing-related trades? Those were considered respectable positions for women, and millinery, hat-making, was especially desirable. Not only did it provide steady work, but it also offered something precious, independence. Some milliners even ran their own shops eventually. The breakfast routine passes in a blur of boiling water, toast, eggs, and endless cups of tea. The boarders barely acknowledge you as they eat, their conversation flowing around you as if you're just another piece of furniture. Only young Mr. Patterson, the law student, offers a "Thank you, Miss Harrington," when you refill his cup. His politeness always catches you off guard. "You're welcome, sir," you murmur, eyes downcast as proper. "Miss Harrington," he says, lowering his voice slightly, "I wonder if you might direct me to a good bookshop nearby. My studies require some additional texts." You blink in surprise. Boarders rarely ask you for anything beyond household matters. "Hatchard's on Piccadilly is excellent, sir. You play be seeding, or if you prefer something less expensive, there's a second-hand book dealer on Crawford Street who has quite a good selection." He smiles. "Crawford Street it is then? Thank you." The interaction lasts all of 20 seconds, but it's still rattling around in your head an hour later as you scrub the dining room floor, someone treating you like a person with knowledge and thoughts rather than just a pair of hands to fetch and carry. The museum guide told me something off the record about Victorian social classes. They weren't quite as rigid in everyday interactions as we imagine. Sure, the overall structure was strict, but in the small moments, people were still just people. Sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, often somewhere in between. By midday, you've completed enough chores to earn a brief reprieve. Mrs. Wilson has gone to the market, and you seize this rare moment of freedom to slip out the back door. The millinery shop is a 20-minute walk away, in a neighbourhood slightly more fashionable than yours. Each step feels both terrifying and exhilarating. You shouldn't be here. You should be at the boarding house preparing the midday meal, but the advertisement burns in your pocket like a hot coal. Madame Beaumont's millinery sits on a corner, its window display showcasing 3 elegant hats on wooden stands. The bell above the door jingles as you enter, and your heart hammers in your chest. Okay, picture this. Victorian hat shops weren't just places to buy headgear. They were like the haute couture fashion houses of their day. Hats were everything. They could make or break a woman's entire look, and ladies with money would spend obscene amounts on them. I'm talking months' rent on a single hat. And milliners? They were like the rock stars of the fashion world. Well, maybe not rock stars, more like respected session musicians. They had real skills, real training, and could make real money. In London and Paris in 1889, over 8,000 women worked in millinery. That's a lot of hats, people. The shop's interior smells of fabric, steam, and the faint chemical tang of dyes. 3 women work at a large table in the back, their hands moving with practiced precision as they shape, stitch, and adorn various hat forms. None of them looks up as you enter. A tall woman emerges from a back room, eyeing you with a practiced gaze that takes in your worn dress and scrubbed hands in an instant. "May I help you?" she asks, her tone suggesting she doubts she can. You swallow hard. "I've come about the apprenticeship position in the advertisement." She raises an eyebrow. "Previous experience?" "None in millinery specifically," you admit, "but I'm skilled with a needle. I did all the household sewing after my mother's eyesight began to fail." "How old are you?" Her gaze is assessing, not unkind, but certainly not warm. 25. Rather old to begin an apprenticeship. The words sting, but you don't let it show. "I'm a quick learner, madame." "Beaumont," she supplies. Though not truly a madam, Miss Beaumont will do. The French touch is simply good for business. "Wait, what? You mean to tell me that the fancy madam was just marketing?" Yep, plenty of Victorian businesses added a French flair to seem more sophisticated and fashionable. Paris was the centre of the fashion world, so a French connection, real or imagined, gave you credibility. It's basically the 1800s version of putting luxury or artisanal in your brand name today. She studies you for another moment, then says, "The work is hard, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. You'll begin as a basic stitcher before learning the more complex techniques. Pay is 2 shillings a week to start. After a year, if you show promise, it rises to 4. 2 shillings a week. It would take months to save enough for a room, but it's something. A beginning. When can you start? She asks. The question catches you off guard. You hadn't expected to be offered the position so quickly. You haven't given notice to Mrs. Wilson. You haven't figured out where you'll live in the meantime. I would need to make some arrangements first, you stammer. Miss Bowman's expression cools slightly. The position may not remain open. There are many women seeking respectable employment. I understand. Could I perhaps begin in 2 weeks' time? She considers this. Very well. 2 weeks. Be here at 6 in the morning, dressed neatly. Bring your own scissors and needles if you have them. Thank you, Miss Beaumont. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. She nods briskly. What is your name? Elizabeth Harrington? Well, Miss Harrington, I shall expect punctuality and diligence. We serve a discerning clientele here. As you leave the shop, your mind races. You've done it. You've secured a position, but now the real challenges begin. Where will you live on 2 shillings a week? How will you survive until your first payment? And how on earth will you tell Mrs. Wilson? On the walk back to the boarding house, you pass a group of young women about your age, dressed in the simple but neat attire of shop girls. They're laughing together, sharing some private joke. When was the last time you laughed like that? When was the last time you had friends to laugh with? Victorian working women often formed tight-knit communities. They had to. The world wasn't exactly cheering them on. Those friendships weren't just nice to have, they were survival mechanisms. You shared rooms to save on rent, nursed each other through illness, lent clothes for job interviews, warned each other about handsy bosses. Without family support, your fellow working women became your family. You slip back into the boarding house just minutes before Mrs. Wilson returns. The afternoon passes in a haze of chores and planning. By evening, you're exhausted but unable to sleep, your mind racing with possibilities and fears. The next morning, you approach Mrs. Wilson as she tallies the accounts in her small office. Mrs. Wilson, might I speak with you for a moment? She looks up, irritated at the interruption. Make it quick, Miss Harrington. The linens need changing. You take a deep breath. I've secured a position at a millinery shop. I'll be leaving in 2 weeks' time. Her pen stills. Leaving? And who, pray tell, will handle your duties here? I'm sure you'll find a suitable replacement, you say, trying to keep your voice steady. Many women are seeking positions. Millinery, she scoffs. Fancy work for fancy ladies. You think you're too good for honest labour now? Not at all, you reply, though her words sting. But I wish to learn a trade. She studies you with narrowed eyes. Very well, but don't come crawling back when you find the work too demanding or the pay too meagre, and I'll expect you to train your replacement before you go. Of course, Mrs. Wilson, thank you for understanding. Understanding is a stretch, but at least she hasn't turned you out on the spot. You have 2 weeks to find accommodations and prepare for your new life. That afternoon, as you polish the banister, young Mr. Patterson passes by on his way out. Good afternoon, Miss Harrington, he says with his usual politeness. Good afternoon, Mr. Patterson, you reply. He hesitates, then says, I found that bookshop on Crawford Street. You were right, their selection is excellent. I'm much obliged for the recommendation. A small thing, this exchange. Insignificant to him, perhaps, but to you, starved as you are for simple human acknowledgement, it feels momentous. You're welcome, sir, you say, and allow yourself the luxury of meeting his eyes as you speak. They're kind eyes, you notice, observant. I heard Mrs. Wilson mention you're leaving us, he says. A new position? You nod. At a millinery shop. Ah, hats. He smiles. My sister adores hats. spends far too much on them, according to my father. They're not merely frivolous, you find yourself saying. A good hat is an investment. It protects from sun and rain, enhances one's appearance, and if well made, can last for years. Where did that come from? Since when do you offer opinions to the boarders? But Mr. Patterson doesn't seem offended. If anything, he appears amused. I shall inform my sister that her extravagance is actually practicality. She'll be delighted with this interpretation. You can't help but smile. Happy to be of service, sir. After he leaves, you return to your polishing, but with a lighter heart. The exchange reminds you that there's a world beyond Mrs. Wilson's critical gaze, a world where you might speak and be heard. The next 2 weeks pass in a whirlwind of preparation. You work during the day and hunt for accommodations in the evenings. Most lodgings are far beyond your means, but finally you find a possibility. A room in a house on Greystone Lane, shared with 3 other working women. The rent is steep, 1 shilling and 6pence per week, but by pooling resources for food and coal you might just manage. Victorian housing was an absolute nightmare if you weren't wealthy. No regulation, no standards. You could end up in a place with 15 people sharing 1 toilet if you were lucky enough to have indoor plumbing at all. Disease spread like wildfire. Privacy, that was a luxury most couldn't afford. But sharing with other working women, that was the hack that made independent living possible. You'd cram 4 women into a room meant for 1, split the costs, and somehow make it work. Was it comfortable? Nope. Was it better than being under someone else's thumb? For many women, absolutely. Your new housemates are all employed, 2 as shop girls and 1 as a typist in a business office. Typewriting was a relatively new field, increasingly popular for middle-class women. It paid decently, was clean, respectable work, and had a certain modern allure to it. The typewriter girl was basically the Victorian equivalent of the sexy librarian archetype. Young, single, in the city, working with cutting-edge technology. Men were both intrigued and slightly threatened by her. She represented this new breed of independent working woman who didn't necessarily need a husband to survive. During your final days at the boarding house, you train your replacement, a quiet girl of 18 named Mary, recently arrived from the countryside. She watches you with wide eyes as you demonstrate the endless tasks that fill your days. How do you remember it all? She asks, after you've explained the specific preferences of each boarder, how Mr. Henderson likes his eggs, how Mrs. Thompson needs her fire built just so, how the elderly sisters require tea at precisely 4 o'clock. You will too, with time, you assure her, and Mrs. Wilson will remind you if you forget. That's putting it mildly. Mrs. Wilson's reminders tend to be sharp enough to draw blood. On your final evening, you pack your meagre possessions, 3 dresses, 2 nightgowns, a shawl, a pair of worn boots, your precious book of poems, and the 9 shillings and 3pence you've managed to save. Everything fits into a single carpet bag. Mrs. Wilson pays you your final wages, 6 shillings for the month, without ceremony or well wishes. The boarders barely notice your departure, with the exception of Mr. Patterson, who surprises you with the gift of a small book, Poems by Christina Rossetti. For your new adventure, he says simply. Every hatmaker should have poetry in her life. The book must have cost at least 2 shillings. It's an extravagant gift and utterly unexpected. I couldn't possibly, you begin. Please, he interrupts. My sister would approve. She's something of a blue stocking herself. A blue stocking, a woman with literary or intellectual interests. It's not always used as a compliment, but the way he says it, warmly and with a slight smile, suggests he views such women with approval. Thank you, you say finally, accepting the slender volume. I shall treasure it. You arrive at your new lodgings on Greystone Lane just as the spring sun is setting. The house is narrow and shabby, but cleaner than you expected. Your room on the third floor is small enough that the 4 beds nearly touch, with a single chest of drawers to be shared and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. Your roommates greet you with curiosity but kindness. Emma and Sarah, the shop girls, work at a draper's establishment nearby. Jane, the typist, has the highest wages and a certain confidence the others lack. "Welcome to our palace," Jane says with a wry smile, helping you set your bag on the one empty bed. "It's not much, but it's ours. Well, technically it's Mr. Finch's, the landlord, but he only comes round on Fridays for the rent." "Thank you," you say, still awkward with these women who are to be your new family of sorts. "I start at Madame, that is, Miss Beaumont's millinery tomorrow." "Beaumont's?" Emma's eyes widen. "That's a proper establishment. They make hats for real ladies, not just middle-class pretenders. How do you land that position?" "I simply applied," you admit. "I had no idea it was particularly prestigious." Sarah laughs. "Everything has a hierarchy in London, haven't you noticed? Even hat shops." That night, squeezed into your narrow bed with the sounds of 3 other women breathing in the darkness, you feel a strange mix of terror and exhilaration. Tomorrow, everything changes. Tomorrow, you begin building something that belongs solely to you. You're still a spinster, still unmarried at the advanced age of 25, still subject to raised eyebrows and pitying glances. But something has shifted. The word doesn't seem quite so heavy anymore. Because here's what they don't tell you about Victorian spinsters. Many of them were trailblazers. They pushed into new professions, created independent lives, and quietly revolutionized what it meant to be a woman in a society that offered them limited options. Your first day at the millinery shop dawns cold but clear. You dress carefully in your best dress, the dark blue one with only a small tear in the sleeve that you've mended so carefully it's nearly invisible. You've polished your boots and arranged your hair neatly beneath your own modest hat. The city is just waking as you make your way to Madame Beaumont's. Street vendors are setting up their carts, delivery boys race past with packages, and the ever-present coal smoke hangs in the air, mingling with the smell of the river and the hundreds of thousands of humans living in close proximity. This is London in 1862, dirty, crowded, chaotic, but also vibrant and alive with possibility. And you're part of it now, not just as an invisible servant in someone else's home, but as a woman making her own way. You arrive at the shop 10 minutes early, breathless with anxiety and anticipation. Miss Beaumont nods approvingly at your punctuality, then introduces you to the other women. Mrs. Carter, the most experienced milliner who handles the most expensive custom orders. Miss Pierce, who specialises in trimmings and decorations, and Miss Walsh, the junior milliner who will be training you. "You'll start with basic stitching," Miss Beaumont explains, leading you to a workstation. "Hats require precision and consistency. Every stitch must be perfect. Perfect stitching when your hands are already chapped from years of housework, when the light in the shop is dim, even with the gas lamps lit, when failure means dismissal and potential destitution, no pressure." But as you take up needle and thread, you find a surprising calm settling over you. This, at least, you know how to do. Your mother taught you to sew when you were barely 6 years old, and your hands remember even if your conscious mind is racing with anxiety. The hours pass in concentrated work. By midday, your back aches from hunching over the fine stitches, but Miss Walsh nods with grudging approval at your work. "Not bad," she says, examining your stitches. "You've sewn before, clearly." My mother was a seamstress before her eyes began to fail, you explain. She taught me. Well, it shows. Keep this up and you might move to basic shaping by month's end. It's not effusive praise, but in this environment, it's significant. You allow yourself a small glow of pride as you break for a quick midday meal. Bread and cheese you've brought from home, eaten quickly in the back room. The afternoon brings more stitching, but also your first glimpse of the true art of millinery as you watch Mrs. Carter create a hat from start to finish for an important client. Her hands move with such surety, transforming flat fabric into sculptural shapes that somehow look both architectural and soft. She adds feathers, silk flowers and ribbons with an artist's eye, creating something that transcends mere function to become a work of art. Magnificent, you whisper, not meaning to speak aloud. Mrs. Carter glances up, catching your eye. It takes years, she says, correctly interpreting your admiration. But yes, it is satisfying work when done properly. By the time you leave that evening, your fingers are pricked and sore. Your eyes strain from focusing on tiny stitches all day, and your shoulders ache from maintaining the same position for hours. But there's a lightness in your step that wasn't there yesterday. You're exhausted. You're terrified about money. 2 shillings a week will barely cover rent and food, leaving nothing for savings or emergencies. You miss the relative security of the boarding house, where at least meals were provided. But for the first time in years, you're also excited. This work has purpose. It has a future. It has the potential to become something more than mere survival. As you walk back to your lodgings in the fading light, you pass wealthy women in carriages wearing hats not unlike the one Mrs. Carter created today. Once you would have seen only the divide between their lives and yours. Now you see something else too, a connection, however tenuous. Their hats and your hands, linked by thread and skill and the strange economy of Victorian womanhood. You're still a spinster by society's reckoning, but tonight, as you clutch your precious book of poems and think about tomorrow's work, you find that the word has lost some of its sting, because maybe, just maybe, being a spinster isn't just about what you lack. Maybe it's also about what you're building, a life, a skill, a future that belongs to no one but yourself. 3 months into your new life and the seasons have shifted. Summer heat bakes London's streets, making the millinery shop a sweatbox by midday. You wipe perspiration from your forehead as you carefully stitch silk flowers onto the brim of a fashionable bonnet. "Not like that," Miss Pierce says, appearing suddenly at your shoulder. The cluster should be tighter. Unpick it and start again. You swallow a sigh and reach for your scissors. This is the 3rd time today you've had to redo your work, and your fingers are sore from the constant pricking of the needle. "How many times do I need to tell you?" she continues, her voice low enough that the customers browsing the front of the shop can't hear. "These hats sell for more than you make in a month. Every detail must be perfect." "Yes, Miss Pierce," you murmur, keeping your eyes down. She moves away, and you begin the delicate work of removing the tiny stitches without damaging the expensive silk. Next to you, Miss Walsh gives you a sympathetic glance. "She had me redo an entire hat brim 6 times when I started," she whispers. "It gets easier." This is the strange contradiction of your new life. The work is grueling. 10 hours a day of eye-straining, finger-numbing detail work. Your back constantly aches from hunching over your workstation. The pay is barely enough to survive on. And yet you're learning, growing. building something. Each day your stitches become more even, your eye for design more refined. Miss Beaumont has even nodded approvingly at some of your recent work. High praise from a woman so sparing with compliments. More than that, you're part of something now. The millinery shop has its own culture, its own rhythms and relationships. You're no longer invisible, but a recognised piece of this small world. The archival records I found from 1862 showed that skilled trades like millinery operated almost like guilds. You didn't just punch a clock, you joined a community with its own hierarchy, traditions and unwritten rules. Beginners like Elizabeth would be tested constantly, not just on their skills, but on their resilience and commitment to the craft. You rework the flower cluster, this time making sure the blooms are arranged in a tighter, more pleasing formation. Your fingers move more confidently now, finding the right tension in the thread, the perfect placement of each petal. When Miss Pierce returns to inspect your work, she merely nods and moves on. Her version of enthusiastic approval. You allow yourself a small, private smile of triumph. At lunchtime, you sit in the back room with the other women, eating the bread and cheese you've brought from home. The conversation flows around you. Gossip about customers, complaints about the heat, discussion of the latest fashions from Paris. Did you see Lady Harwood's face when Miss Beaumont suggested the green feathers instead of the blue? Miss Walsh laughs. Looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. The green suits her colouring better, Mrs. Carter says authoritatively. Miss Beaumont has an excellent eye. Lady Harwood doesn't want what suits her, Miss Pierce counters. She wants what her sister-in-law had last week, only bigger and more impressive. Speaking of impressive, Miss Walsh turns to you. Your stitching has improved tremendously, Miss Harrington. Those roses you did yesterday were quite fine. The compliment catches you off guard. Thank you, you say, feeling your cheeks warm. I've had excellent teachers. Mrs. Carter smiles slightly. Flattery will get you everywhere, Miss Harrington. This easy camaraderie still feels new to you. At the boarding house, you were isolated, neither family nor friend, just a pair of hands to perform tasks. Here, despite the hierarchy and occasional sharp corrections, you belong. After work, you walk home with Miss Walsh, Annie, as she's asked you to call her when you're not at the shop. The two of you have fallen into the habit of stopping at a small bakery on Fridays when the baker sells yesterday's goods at half price. Look, Annie says, pointing to a display of currant buns. 2 for a penny today. Shall we splurge? You hesitate, mentally calculating your budget. 2 shillings a week in wages, 1 shilling 6pence for rent. That leaves 6pence for food, coal and any other necessities. A halfpenny for a bun is an extravagance, but it's been a long week of demanding work, and the rare treat might lift your spirits. Yes, you decide. Let's splurge. The bun, slightly stale but still sweet, is delicious. You and Annie eat as you walk, savouring each bite. Oh, I meant to tell you, Annie says between mouthfuls. Mrs. Fairchild is coming in tomorrow for a fitting. You should make sure you're nearby. Mrs. Fairchild is one of the shop's wealthiest clients, known for her exacting standards and generous tips to the girls who please her. Do you think Miss Beaumont would let me assist? You ask hopefully. Probably not directly, Annie admits, but if you happen to be working on trimmings in the vicinity, Mrs. Fairchild often asks opinions from everyone present. She fancies herself a great patroness of working women. You nod, understanding the strategy. In the complex ecosystem of the millinery shop, such small opportunities can lead to advancement and eventually higher wages. Victorian shopping wasn't just a transaction, it was a performance. Upper-class women didn't just buy things, they enacted their status through elaborate shopping rituals. They expected deference and flattery, but some, like our fictional Mrs. Fairchild, also saw themselves as benevolent figures, lifting up working-class women through their patronage. It was weird, patronising, and still somehow better than being treated like furniture. Your lodgings on Greystone Lane have become more home-like over the past months. The small room you share with Emma, Sarah and Jane is still cramped, but you've each found ways to carve out tiny territories of privacy. Your bed has a colourful quilt sent by your mother, and you've hung a small shelf above it where you keep your precious books, now numbering 3, with the addition of a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets found in a second-hand shop. Jane, the typist, has been teaching all of you to read the newspaper critically, pointing out biases and omissions in the reporting. She's involved with a women's discussion group that meets monthly to debate topics ranging from working conditions to voting rights. You should come to the next meeting, she tells you as you all prepare for bed that night. Miss Crawford is speaking about employment opportunities for middle-class women. She's quite compelling. You hesitate. Such meetings feel dangerously close to politics, territory your mother always warned was unbecoming for respectable women. But then again, is anything about your life now what your mother would have considered respectable? Perhaps I will, you say finally. Late in the night, you're awakened by the sound of coughing. Sarah, in the bed next to yours, is sitting up trying to muffle the harsh, racking sounds with her pillow. Sarah, you whisper, sitting up. Are you unwell? It's nothing, she whispers back hoarsely. Just a summer chill. Go back to sleep. But in the grey light of dawn, you can see her pillow is spotted with blood. Consumption, the disease everyone fears, that steals away so many young women in their prime. You need to rest, you tell her. Stay home today. She shakes her head frantically. I can't. Mr. Davis said if any of us miss another day this month, we needn't bother coming back at all. Emma sits up, her face concerned. Sarah, you're ill, properly ill, and I'll be properly homeless if I lose my position, Sarah counters, already rising shakily to dress. It will pass. It always does. You and Emma exchange worried glances, but what can you say? Sarah's fear is well-founded. In the brutal economics of Victorian employment, workers were utterly disposable. Illness was considered a moral failing as much as a physical one, a sign of weakness or poor constitution. So Sarah goes to work, her face pale but determined. You go to your own job with her cough echoing in your ears, a reminder of how precarious this independence truly is. Mrs. Fairchild does indeed come to the shop that day, sweeping in with a rustle of expensive silk and the scent of French perfume. Just as Annie predicted, Miss Beaumont allows you to work nearby, arranging silk flowers for another order while the wealthy customer is attended to. Oh, these are lovely, Mrs. Fairchild says, noticing the small blossoms in your hands. Are they for my hat? Before Miss Beaumont can intervene, you reply, no ma'am, these are for Mrs. Henderson's bonnet, but they would complement your colouring beautifully. Miss Beaumont gives you a sharp look for speaking directly to the customer, but Mrs. Fairchild seems pleased by your observation. Would they indeed? Perhaps we should reconsider the trimming, Miss Beaumont. This young woman has a good eye. Your heart pounds as Miss Beaumont smoothly redirects the conversation, neither confirming nor denying your suggestion. You've overstepped and there will likely be consequences later, but Mrs. Fairchild has noticed you, and in the complex calculus of the shop that counts for something. Sure enough, when the customer leaves, having ordered a hat with flowers suspiciously similar to the ones you were arranging, Miss Beaumont calls you into her office. Miss Harrington, she says coolly. While your observation about the flowers was not incorrect, you must remember your place. Customers should be addressed only when they speak to you directly, and even then with the utmost deference. Yes, Miss Beaumont, you say, eyes lowered. I apologise for my presumption. However, she continues, her tone softening slightly, Mrs. Fairchild was impressed by your aesthetic judgment. She has specifically requested that you assist with the trimming of her hat. You look up, startled. Me? Under Mrs. Carter's supervision, of course. You're not ready for independent work of that calibre, but it's an opportunity to learn from our most experienced milliner, working on a premium commission. She pauses. Don't squander it. I won't, Miss Beaumont. Thank you. As you leave her office, you can't help the small smile that tugs at your lips. It's a tiny victory, but a victory nonetheless. A step forward. That evening, you go with Jane to the women's discussion meeting, held in the back room of a small tea shop. About 20 women are gathered there, most appearing to be from the middle classes, though a few, like you and Jane, are clearly working women. Miss Crawford, the speaker, is a formidable-looking woman in her 40s, dressed in severe but fashionable attire. She speaks with confidence about the changing landscape of women's employment. The census of 1851 confirmed what many of us already knew, she tells the assembled group. There are simply not enough men for every woman to marry. Society must acknowledge this reality and create pathways for women to support themselves with dignity. Her words resonate with you. How many times had you been made to feel like a failure for not securing a husband, as if the demographics were your personal moral shortcoming rather than a simple mathematical fact? The question should not be, why are these women unmarried? Miss Crawford continues, but rather, how can we ensure these women have opportunities for meaningful work and independence? Around you, heads nod in agreement. The term surplus women makes you wince, as if you're excess inventory in a warehouse, but the acknowledgement of your existence, your right to a place in society, feels revolutionary. After the speech, small groups form for discussion. You find yourself in conversation with 3 other women, Jane, a governess named Miss Taylor, and a quiet woman in her 30s who introduces herself as Miss Pembroke, a bookkeeper. What did you think of the speech? Miss Pembroke asks you. It was illuminating, you reply carefully, still wary of expressing political opinions too freely. I hadn't considered the census figures in quite that light before. It changes the narrative, doesn't it? Miss Taylor says eagerly. Instead of pitying the poor spinster, society ought to be ensuring she has the education and opportunity to support herself. Precisely, Jane agrees, though I think Miss Crawford could have gone further. It's not just about survival, but about women having the chance to pursue their own ambitions, just as men do. The conversation continues, flowing from employment to education to the broader question of women's place in society. You mostly listen, occasionally offering observations from your own experience. It's exhilarating to hear your private thoughts echoed and expanded upon by these thoughtful, articulate women. On the walk home, Jane is animated, discussing the various points raised in the meeting. You're quieter, processing all you've heard. What did you really think? She asks finally. Too radical for you? You consider the question carefully. Not too radical, you say slowly. More like, I've felt these things but never heard them spoken aloud. It's strange to discover your private thoughts are actually part of a larger conversation. She smiles. That's how movements begin. Individual discontent becomes collective action. I wouldn't call myself discontented, you protest. I'm fortunate to have found decent employment. Are you, though? Jane challenges gently, working 10 hours a day for wages that barely cover your needs, having to choose between a currant bun and saving for emergencies. Being told you should be grateful for the chance to serve others. Put that way, it does sound rather bleak. Yet compared to the boarding house, compared to the workhouse, compared to so many women's situations... It's a beginning, you say finally, not an ending. Jane squeezes your arm. That's the spirit. We start where we are and build from there. When you reach your lodgings, you find Emma waiting anxiously by the door. Thank goodness you're back, she says, pulling you both inside. It's Sarah. The coughing got worse. Mrs. Davis sent her home early and she's been bringing up blood. You rush upstairs to find Sarah in bed, her face alarmingly pale against the pillow. Her breathing is laboured and a handkerchief spotted with blood is clutched in her hand. I've sent for the doctor, Emma says, wringing her hands, but you know how they are about coming to this neighbourhood. Victorian medicine was a hit-or-miss affair, especially if you weren't wealthy. Doctors might prescribe everything from bleedings to mercury to cocaine, depending on their training and preferences, and many simply wouldn't bother with poor patients, knowing the fee might never be paid. We need to cool her fever, you say decisively, falling back on your mother's remedies. Jane, could you fetch water? Emma, help me get her into a fresh nightgown. She's soaked through with sweat. The three of you work together, caring for Sarah as best you can. The doctor eventually arrives, a young man with kind eyes who examines Sarah thoroughly before delivering his verdict. Consumption, as I'm sure you've guessed, he tells you quietly, stepping aside from the bed. Not advanced, but concerning. She needs rest, good food, and clean air. For how long, you ask, already calculating the financial implications. At least a month, possibly longer. A month without wages, a month of rent and food to somehow cover. The four of you exchange glances, the same thought in all your minds. How? I have some savings, Jane offers. Not much, but enough to help with her share of the rent for a few weeks. We can take in sewing, Emma suggests. Extra work in the evenings. And I might be able to ask for a small advance on my wages, you add, though the thought of approaching Miss Beaumont with such a request makes your stomach clench. The doctor watches this exchange with interest. You ladies aren't family. Not by blood, Jane answers with a slight lift of her chin, but we look after our own. He nods, seemingly impressed. I'll return in 3 days to check on her progress, keep her comfortable, make sure she drinks plenty of fluids, and open the windows when the air outside is clean. After he leaves, the three of you sit by Sarah's bed, discussing plans in low voices. You'll take turns staying home with her, using precious days off and negotiating with your respective employers. You'll pool resources for medicine and nutritious food. You'll make it work somehow. This is the hidden safety net of Victorian spinsterhood, the community of women who create family where society says none should exist. It's not perfect, not secure, certainly not easy, but it's real and vital and sometimes the only thing standing between survival and disaster. As you finally go to bed in the early hours of the morning, exhausted from worry and planning, you think about Miss Crawford's speech. The world might see you as surplus women, but there's nothing surplus about the bonds you're forming, the lives you're building. Tomorrow, you'll go back to the millinery shop, back to the endless hours of detailed work for meagre pay. You'll assist Mrs. Carter with Mrs. Fairchild's premium hat commission. You'll keep your eyes down and your voice respectful and your ambitions carefully hidden. But something has shifted. The conversations from the meeting echo in your mind, mingling with the practical challenges of caring for Sarah, the small triumph of impressing a wealthy customer, the ongoing struggle to transform yourself from invisible servant to skilled artisan. You are a Victorian spinster, unmarried at 25, making your way in a world designed for dependence. Society may still view you as an object of pity or scorn, but tonight, lying in your narrow bed in a room shared with women who have become more family than mere roommates, you feel something unexpected, not contentment exactly. The challenges are too great, the future too uncertain for that. But possibility. The possibility that being a spinster isn't the end of your story, but the beginning, and that perhaps is worth more than all the security marriage might have offered. Autumn arrives with its peculiar London mix of fog, coal smoke and decaying leaves. 6 months into your new life, and the changes have been subtle but significant. Your fingers, once soft from years of household work, now bear the permanent calluses of a milliner. Your eye has sharpened, able to spot an uneven stitch or misplaced trim from across the workroom. And your wages have increased from 2 shillings to 2 shillings and 6pence per week. A small victory, but in the precarious economics of your life, those extra 6pence make a meaningful difference. Sarah has recovered enough to return to work, though her cough persists, especially in the damp mornings. The 4 of you managed to cover her expenses during her illness, but it depleted everyone's meagre savings. Now you're all working extra hours where possible, trying to rebuild that fragile safety net. Miss Harrington, Miss Beaumont calls from the front of the shop. Mrs. Fairchild is here for her final fitting. Please assist Mrs. Carter. You set aside the wire frame you've been covering and move to the front where Mrs. Fairchild waits in a cloud of expensive perfume. The hat you helped create, a confection of green velvet with silk flowers cascading down one side, rests on the counter. Ah, the young woman with the good eye, Mrs. Fairchild says, recognising you. Tell me honestly, does this suit my complexion as well as you suggested it would? Mrs. Carter shoots you a warning glance. Direct opinions are still not your place, but Mrs. Fairchild is clearly expecting an answer. It complements you beautifully, ma'am, you say carefully. The particular shade of green brings out the warmth in your eyes. Mrs. Fairchild beams, turning to examine herself in the mirror with the hat perched atop her elaborately styled hair. You're quite right. Much better than that dreadful blue my sister-in-law chose. I shall wear this to Lady Montgomery's tea next week, and Charlotte will be positively green herself, with envy. She laughs at her own joke, and you smile politely, helping Mrs. Carter make a small adjustment to the hat's position. The young woman has talent, Mrs. Fairchild comments to Miss Beaumont, who has materialised nearby. You should nurture it. Miss Harrington is coming along quite well, Miss Beaumont agrees with measured praise. We have hopes for her progress. After the customer leaves with her purchase, Miss Beaumont calls you into her office again. Your stomach tightens with anxiety. Have you overstepped again, despite your care? Mrs. Fairchild was very pleased with her hat, Miss Beaumont begins, her expression giving nothing away. She specifically mentioned your contribution. Mrs. Carter deserves the credit, you say quickly. I merely assisted with the smallest details. Indeed, however, your eye for colour and proportion has been noticed. She taps her fingers on her desk, studying you. I believe you're ready for more responsibility. Beginning next week, you'll assist Miss Pierce with design consultations for our middle-tier customers. Your heart skips. Design consultations mean direct customer interaction, a step up from basic construction work, and potentially better pay in the future. Thank you, Miss Beaumont, you say, trying to keep your voice steady. I'm grateful for the opportunity. She nods briskly. Don't disappoint me. You may return to your work now. You float back to your workstation, barely feeling the floor beneath your feet. Annie glances up, raising an eyebrow in question. Design consultations, you whisper, with Miss Pierce. Her eyes widen, and she gives you a quick smile before returning to her work. Later, she'll want all the details, but for now, the workroom discipline must be maintained. By evening, the news has spread among the shop's employees. When you leave with Annie, she links her arm through yours, excitedly. Design consultations after only 6 months, she says. It took me nearly 2 years to move up from basic construction. Miss Beaumont must see real potential in you. Or Mrs. Fairchild's approval carries more weight than we realise, you suggest, still unable to quite believe your good fortune. Perhaps, but Miss Beaumont isn't easily swayed by customers' opinions. She knows quality work when she sees it. The warm glow of professional recognition carries you all the way back to your lodgings, where you share the news with your housemates. "We should celebrate," Jane declares. "I've been saving a bit of sugar. We could make barley water with lemon." Such a simple treat, but in your world, it's a luxury worth savouring. As the 4 of you sit around the room's small table, sipping the sweet tart drink, Emma raises her cup in a toast to Elizabeth and her swift ascent in the millinery world. Soon she'll be opening her own shop and employing all of us. You laugh, but there's a seed of possibility in the joke. Could you, someday? Women did own businesses in Victorian London, though the challenges were considerable. Still, the thought of a shop with your name on the sign sends a pleasant shiver down your spine. "Speaking of advancement," Jane says, "there's another meeting next week. A woman from Manchester is speaking about the formation of women's trade unions. You should all come." Emma shakes her head. "Mr. Davis already watches us like a hawk. If he heard I was involved with unions, I'd be dismissed on the spot. That's exactly why unions are necessary," Jane argues. "The arbitrary power employers hold over our livelihoods is unconscionable." Unions were starting to form for many trades in Victorian England, but they were still controversial. Men's unions were becoming more established, but women's unions, those were seen as particularly radical. Women organising for better pay and conditions challenged the whole idea that women should work for the love of it or out of desperate necessity, not as a career with standards and rights. The discussion continues, passionate but good-natured, until Sarah's coughing interrupts. You all turn with concern as she presses a handkerchief to her mouth. "Just the damp," she insists when the spasm passes. "I'm much better, truly." But her face is too pale, and the handkerchief, which she quickly tucks away, bears fresh spots of blood. The doctor's visits have continued, though less frequently, and his expression grows more concerned each time. That night, as you prepare for bed, Jane pulls you aside. "We need to talk about Sarah," she whispers. "The doctor says she shouldn't be working in the shop. All that dust from the fabrics is making her worse. But she can't stop working," you whisper back. "None of us can afford to support her indefinitely." "I know, but there might be another option." Jane glances over to make sure Sarah and Emma are out of earshot. "My uncle has a cottage in Sussex. It's small, just 2 rooms, but it's in the countryside. Clean air, quiet surroundings. He's agreed to let Sarah stay there for a nominal rent, just enough to cover basic maintenance." "That's wonderful," you exclaim softly. "But how would she live? What would she eat?" "That's the challenge," Jane admits. "She'd need some income. I thought perhaps piecework, sewing she could do at her own pace, in good light, with fresh air." The idea has merit. Many women did piecework from home, making gloves, finishing garments, or creating small items that could be sold to shops in London. The pay was even worse than regular employment, but for someone in Sarah's condition, it might be the only viable option. "We should ask at the shop," you suggest. "Miss Beaumont might know of suppliers looking for pieceworkers." Jane nods. "I was hoping you'd say that. Sarah respects you. She's more likely to consider it if you're supportive." The responsibility settles on your shoulders, another small weight in a life already laden with them. Yet strangely, it doesn't feel burdensome. 6 months ago, you were adrift, a woman without purpose or place. Now you're embedded in a network of care and obligation that gives meaning to each day. The next morning, you approach Mrs. Carter during a quiet moment. Of all the senior staff, she's shown you the most kindness, and her connections in the trade are extensive. "A friend with consumption," she repeats when you explain the situation. "How severe?" "Improving, but the doctor says she needs country air. She's skilled with a needle. She works at Davis's draper's shop currently." Mrs. Carter considers. "As it happens, my sister runs a small business, making baby clothes. Fine work, mostly for the middle-class trade. She often needs extra hands, especially as the Christmas season approaches. The pay isn't much." "Anything would help," you assure her. "I'll speak with her then. No promises, but she's a soft touch for a worthy case." You thank her profusely, hope blooming in your chest. It's not a perfect solution, but it's something, a chance for Sarah to heal, to perhaps escape the fate that claims so many young working women in London. That Sunday, you're one day free from the shop. You take a rare trip across town to visit your mother. The omnibus fare is a luxury you allow yourself monthly, unwilling to lose the fragile connection to your past. Your mother's lodgings are humble, a single room in a house owned by a distant cousin who took pity after your father's death. She supports herself with seamstress work now, though her failing eyesight makes it increasingly difficult. "Elizabeth," she exclaims as you enter, rising to embrace you. "You look well. The work agrees with you." You hug her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender water and clean linen. "It does, Mother. How are your eyes?" "No worse," she says, which you know means no better. "Tell me about the shop. Are they treating you fairly?" You settle at her small table, sharing the tea and bread she's prepared for your visit. You tell her about your promotion to design consultations, about Mrs. Fairchild's approval, about the techniques you're learning. "I always knew you had a gift with the needle," she says proudly. "Your father would be so pleased to see you establishing yourself." Would he, though? Wouldn't he rather have seen you safely married, conforming to society's expectations? You don't voice these doubts, unwilling to dim her pleasure in your modest success. "And what of your living situation?" she asks carefully. 4 young women alone. It's most unusual." "We manage well enough," you assure her. "We look after each other." She hesitates, then says, "Mrs. Pembroke mentioned she saw you at a meeting of a political nature." Your spine stiffens. Mrs. Pembroke must be related to the quiet bookkeeper from the women's discussion group, and apparently not as discreet as one might hope. "It was an educational talk," you say carefully, "about employment opportunities for women." Your mother sighs. "Elizabeth, I understand the necessity of your working, but involving yourself in politics, it's not proper for a young woman of your background." "Mother, it was hardly revolutionary, just women discussing practical matters that affect our lives." "Even so," she takes your hand. "I worry for your reputation. Without that, what hope is there for your future?" She means marriage, of course. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death claimed 25 million lives across Europe, wiping out up to 80% of the population in some cities. The plague was swift and merciless, but for those who survived, life continued in a radically transformed world. Here's what happened after the Black Death devastated Europe. Hey, quick thing before we start. If you actually listen to these regularly, hit like or subscribe. I always wonder where everyone's at, so comment your city and what time it is. Weird to think some of you are having breakfast in London while I'm recording this at night here in the States. Alright, let's head back to Europe in the aftermath of the Black Death. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously. Adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket, because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. Your eyes open to darkness. The straw mattress beneath you is damp from the night's moisture that seeps through the walls of your small home. For a moment, everything feels normal. That familiar, scratchy texture against your skin, the smoky smell from last night's fire, the distant sound of a rooster, then it hits you. The silence. No voices in the street, no clanging of the blacksmith's hammer, no children laughing or crying, just nothing. You're probably wondering, wait, how unusual would this really be? Well, imagine your neighbourhood completely empty except for maybe every fifth house. That's what we're talking about here. You rise and step onto the packed dirt floor, cold against your bare feet. Not like your warm carpet or wood floors today. Medieval floors were usually just compressed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that wouldn't be changed for months. Yeah, not exactly the pinnacle of hygiene, which didn't help with the whole plague situation. I spent way too long researching medieval sleeping arrangements for this. Turns out most people slept on simple straw mattresses, often with their whole family and even animals nearby for warmth. Privacy, not a concept they were familiar with, and these weren't memory foam mattresses. Just sacks stuffed with whatever was available. Straw, hay, sometimes wool if you were lucky. As you step outside, the morning sun illuminates a village transformed. The blood-red sunrise feels appropriate somehow. Down the lane where the baker's shop once filled the air with the smell of fresh bread, the door hangs open. No one has been there for weeks. The baker and his entire family gone. In your head, you're thinking, is anyone even left? The rational part of your brain knows there must be others, but the emotional part feels utterly alone in this moment. You make your way to the village centre. Before the plague, this would have been bustling with activity. Merchants setting up for the day, villagers drawing water from the well, church bells calling people to morning prayer. Now, the well sits untouched, the church door closed. The silence is broken only by the occasional bird or the wind rustling through empty market stalls. "Hello," you call out, your voice sounding foreign even to yourself. "Is anyone there?" There's a shuffle from a nearby house and an old woman appears, her face gaunt and suspicious. She's carrying a small bundle of herbs, rosemary, thyme, lavender, clutched tightly to her nose. "Stay back," she says, eyeing you cautiously. "You got the sickness?" The sickness. That's what many called it. Others called it the Great Mortality, the Pestilence, or the Great Plague. The term Black Death wasn't actually used until centuries later. "No," you reply, "my family," but you can't finish the sentence. She nods, understanding without words. Her bundle of herbs is what people believed would protect them from bad air, the miasma theory that disease spread through foul smells. So they carried sweet-smelling herbs, or flowers, to counteract it. Completely useless against the actual cause, bacteria carried by fleas on rats, but they didn't know that. "The priest is collecting the dead," she says flatly. "They're digging a pit outside the village, a mass grave." The normal burial customs had broken down completely. One Florentine chronicler wrote about how burial shrouds shot up to 10 times their normal price. And even then, there weren't enough people to dig individual graves. Bodies were piled in great pits, often with little or no ceremony. You follow the path she indicates, and over the rise you see them, a small group of figures, some digging, others dragging wrapped bodies. The smell hits you before you get close, that unmistakable sweet rot of decomposition. Stay with me here, because this is where it gets weird. The person in charge of this grim work isn't the priest as you'd expect, but a local butcher. The priest died 2 weeks ago. The The butcher, with his experience handling dead flesh, has become the default undertaker. "We need hands," he calls when he sees you. Not hello or good morning, just a demand for labour. In a world where perhaps 2/3 of your community has vanished, every surviving pair of hands is precious. Picture this. By mid-1349, in places like Florence, Italy, so many people had died that the survivors couldn't keep up with the burial needs. They'd dump bodies in large trenches, layer them with a thin covering of soil, add another layer of bodies, more soil, and so on. Some of these mass graves have been discovered centuries later during construction projects, revealing the grim efficiency of plague-time burial practices. The next few hours blur as you help move the dead. These are people you knew, the miller's wife, the cooper's son, an entire family from the edge of the village. Their bodies are bloated and discoloured, many with the telltale black swellings in the armpits or groin that gave the plague one of its names, the pestilential buboes. Or last week, the butcher says as you pause to catch your breath, a man from the next village came looking for food, said there wasn't a single living soul left there, everyone dead or fled. Imagine that reality for a second. Entire villages just gone. Archaeological evidence has confirmed this happened. We've found abandoned medieval villages where excavations suggest sudden abandonment during the plague years. By midday, your stomach is growling. You realise you haven't eaten since yesterday. With the baker dead, where will bread come from? With so many farmers dead, who will harvest the crops? This is where the first major economic shift began. Food prices skyrocketed immediately after the plague hit a region. According to that Florentine chronicler I mentioned, the food suitable for the sick, cakes and sugar, reached outrageous prices. Chicken and other poultry were unbelievably expensive. You make your way to what once was the marketplace, hoping to find someone selling something, anything edible. There's a single vendor there, an old man with a cart containing a few withered vegetables and a small sack of grain. Around him, a handful of survivors argue over the prices. 6 pennies for a loaf? A woman shouts. That's robbery. Take it or starve, the vendor replies coldly. There's no one left to work the fields. He's not wrong. Farms lay abandoned, crops rotting in the ground. Farmers had died or fled, leaving the fields untended. Domestic animals wandered freely with no one to care for them. In some places, sheep and cattle died in the fields because there was no one to herd them. Okay, picture this. You're standing there watching people argue over the last scraps of food when suddenly the church bell rings. Everyone freezes. This isn't the normal call to prayer. It's erratic, desperate. You all rush toward the church where a lone survivor is pulling frantically on the bell rope. Riders, he shouts, coming from the east. Fear ripples through the small gathering. Riders could mean many things, none of them good. Bandits taking advantage of weakened villages. Officials coming to collect taxes despite the devastation. Or worse, people fleeing from another plague outbreak, potentially bringing the disease back to your village. The small crowd debates what to do. Some want to hide, others to stand their ground. In your head, you're screaming, "This is how I die," either by bandits or by plague. But before a decision can be made, the riders appear at the village edge. It's the Lord's son, returned from a nearby town with several armed men and a wagon of supplies. His father, the local lord, died of the plague months ago. "I've brought grain," he announces, his voice carrying across the square, "and I need workers for the fields. I'll pay double the usual wage." This moment right here, this is history pivoting. See, before the Black Death, peasants were essentially bound to the land, working for whatever the Lord decided to give them, which wasn't much. But with so many dead, the surviving workers suddenly had leverage. Labour shortages meant that workers could demand higher wages and better conditions. The young lord continues, "I need 10 strong people to prepare the fields for planting, 10 pennies a day each." A murmur runs through the crowd. 10 pennies is an unheard of wage. Before the plague, you might have earned 2 pennies for a full day of backbreaking labour. "And what of our own lands?" someone calls out. "We have fields too, if we could get seed." The lord hesitates, calculating. "Work my fields first, and I'll ensure you have seed for your own." There's a collective hesitation. The old order would have demanded immediate obedience, but the world has changed. Finally, a few step forward, agreeing to the terms. Others hold back, suspicious of promises. And this negotiation, this wasn't something that would have happened before. The massive death toll had disrupted the entire social hierarchy. As one chronicler observed after the plague, once the plague had finished, anybody who could get a hold of whatsoever kind of cloth or found the raw materials to make it became rich. Similarly, survivors inherited goods and wealth from their deceased family members. A person who previously had nothing could suddenly find themselves quite rich. You spend the afternoon helping distribute grain from the Lord's wagon. As the sun begins to set, you return to your empty home. The silence still unnerves you, but there's something else now, a strange sense of possibility. What was once your parents' home is now yours. The tools your father crafted are now yours to use or sell. The small plot of land, while not much, is still more than you ever expected to own. As you light a small fire in the hearth, you consider the day. 24 hours ago, you were overwhelmed by grief and shock. Now there's still grief that won't fade for years, maybe never, but there's also something unexpected, opportunity. Because here's the twist. While the Black Death was unquestionably one of the worst disasters in human history, killing millions and leaving survivors traumatized, it also accidentally created opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Land became available. Wages increased. Social mobility became possible in a way it hadn't been before. This isn't to say things were suddenly great. They weren't. The psychological toll was immense. Petrarch, an Italian poet who lived through the plague, wrote to his brother, "I would, my brother, that I had never been born, or at least had died before these times." He doubted that people of the future, that's us, could possibly understand their suffering. You lie back on your straw mattress, so different from your comfortable bed today. The emptiness of the house presses in on you. Before the plague, you would have been crowded in with parents, siblings, maybe grandparents or other relatives. Now it's just you. As you drift towards sleep, you wonder what tomorrow will bring in this new, emptier world. Will more survivors emerge from hiding? Will the crops be planted in time? Will the plague return? Unlike your peaceful bedroom tonight, with its security and comfort, a medieval survivor of the Black Death would fall asleep each night with profound uncertainty about the future. Yet despite that uncertainty, life would continue, and as we'll see tomorrow, the social fabric of Europe wouldn't just recover, it would transform completely. The grief and horror of mass death would gradually give way to something unexpected, a social revolution that would help pave the way for the modern world. But that's a story for another part of our journey. The second morning after the plague feels different. There's a strange energy in the air. Not hope exactly, but something shifting. You step outside to see a few more people in the village square than yesterday. Some faces you recognize, others are strangers who've wandered in from neighbouring settlements where they were the only survivors. The Lord's Son is organising workers for the fields, still offering those unheard-of wages. But today, something unexpected is happening. A well-dressed man you've never seen before is arguing with him, loudly. "This is my land now," the stranger insists, waving a piece of parchment. "My cousin died with no heirs." I have the legal right. The lord's son looks ready to draw his sword. Your cousin was my father's tenant. This land belongs to my family. And here we see another weird side effect of the plague. Property disputes were absolutely everywhere. When people died without clear heirs, distant relatives showed up making claims. Court records from the years after the plague are packed with inheritance cases. Imagine a family tree being pruned so severely that branches that never expected to inherit anything suddenly had legal claims. A crowd gathers to watch the argument. Next to you, an old farmer spits on the ground. Let them fight over it. Meanwhile, who plants the crops? We'll all starve by winter. He's not wrong. While the nobility and emerging merchant class fought over who owned what, practical matters, like food production, hung in the balance. You can inherit all the land in England, but if nobody's growing food, what good is it? You worked for the old lord, right? Asks a woman beside you, a child clutching her skirt. Will you work the fields again? You hesitate. Before the plague, you'd have had no choice. But now there are options. 10 pennies is good wage, you say, testing the waters. The tanner in the next village is offering 12, she replies casually, for anyone who can help him process hides. He lost both his apprentices. Okay, freeze this moment right here. This conversation, this casual mention of shopping around for better wages, this was revolutionary. Before the plague, most peasants were tied to the land through serfdom or other obligations. The idea of just picking up and going somewhere for better pay? Unthinkable for most, but the massive labour shortage changed everything. Meanwhile, the lord and the newcomer are still arguing. The lord's son finally shouts, "We'll take this to the king's court." The stranger laughs. The king's court. Half the judges are dead, and the other half have fled London. Who's going to hear your case? He's got a point. The legal system, like everything else, had collapsed in many areas. Records from this period show court sessions cancelled, delayed for months or years, or conducted with whoever happened to be available rather than proper officials. You decide to follow the woman with the child, curious about this tanner offering higher wages. As you walk through the village, you notice something odd. Doors standing open on several houses. People are just taking what they need, the woman explains, following your gaze. No one left to claim it. Inside one abandoned home, you glimpse someone filling a sack with cooking pots, tools, clothing. Not stealing exactly, more like redistributing. Who was left to say who owned what? This massive wealth redistribution wasn't just happening with small items. In Florence, one chronicler recalled, once the plague had finished, anybody who could get a hold of whatsoever kind of cloth or found the raw materials to make it became rich. Similarly, survivors inherited goods and wealth from their deceased family members. A person who previously had nothing could suddenly find themselves quite rich. The woman leads you to a crossroads where a small group has gathered around a makeshift market, just a few blankets spread with goods. But these aren't normal market goods. There are silver cups, fine linen, tools, jewellery, things that would have been far beyond your reach before. Where did all this come from, you ask, though you already know. The dead don't need silver, says the man sitting cross-legged behind the display. He's missing 2 fingers and has the rough hands of someone who worked the fields his whole life. Found a whole chest of this stuff in my master's house after everyone there died. Figured I'd trade it for things I can actually use. You reach out to touch a silver goblet, then hesitate. It feels wrong somehow, profiting from so much death. The peasant notices your hesitation. "Oh, look," he says flatly, "my whole family's gone. Took them all in 3 days. You think I wanted this cup instead? But here we are. Might as well make use of what's left." I've studied accounts from plague survivors, and this practical approach was common, not because people were heartless, but because the sheer scale of death made prolonged mourning almost impossible. Society had to continue functioning. You trade a small knife you've carried for years for a wool blanket that would have cost you a month's wages before. As you fold it, the woman touches your arm. "The tanner's this way," she says, nodding down a path. "If you're interested." The tan yard sits at the edge of a neighbouring village, the sharp smell of urine, lime and animal hides hitting you long before you see it. Tanning was one of those necessary but deeply unpleasant medieval trades that nobody wanted to live near. The process used urine and animal brains to prepare hides. Yeah, really appetizing, I know. The tanner himself is a burly man with forearms like tree trunks. He looks up from scraping a hide as you approach. "You here to work?" he asks without preamble. "Maybe," you reply cautiously. "Heard you're paying 12 pennies. 15 now," he says. "Lost another worker yesterday, not to the plague. He just took off with some silver he found in an abandoned house, going to try his luck in London." The tanner spits. "Fool, city's got hit worse than anywhere." And he was right about that. Urban centres, with their crowded conditions, suffered death rates sometimes exceeding 50–60% of the population. In contrast, some isolated rural areas lost only a third of their people. Cold comfort, but it meant different recovery patterns. "Never tanned before," you admit. The tanner shrugs. "Can you follow instructions? Not afraid of mess? That's all I need. I can teach the rest." Before you can answer, there's a commotion from the village centre, bells ringing, shouts. You and the tanner exchange glances and hurry toward the sound. A rider on a lathered horse has arrived, bringing news from the nearest large town. A crowd gathers as he gulps water from a proffered cup. "The bishop's declared all debts to the church forgiven," the messenger announces, "says it's God's mercy for survivors." Murmurs run through the crowd. Church forgiveness of debts was a big deal. Many peasants were perpetually in debt to religious institutions that owned vast tracts of land. "What of the king's taxes?" someone calls out. The rider laughs, a harsh sound. "King's collectors tried to enter 3 villages. 2 were driven off with pitchforks. The 3rd hasn't been seen since." This was real, by the way. Tax collection broke down completely in many areas. Some collectors were attacked, others simply found ghost towns with no one left to tax. Records show royal revenues plummeted. "And the guilds in town?" asks an older man, likely a craftsman. "Are they taking new members?" Before the plague, craft guilds, organisations controlling trades like baking, metalworking or weaving, were notoriously exclusive. They limited membership to protect their monopolies and keep prices high. "The Weavers' Guild is taking anyone who can thread a loom," the messenger replies. "Half their members are dead, and they have orders backed up from before the sickness." It's hard to overstate how significant this was. Guilds that once required 7-year apprenticeships and family connections were suddenly desperate for anyone with basic skills. Social mobility that would have been impossible before was now there for the taking. You look back at the tanner, considering his offer. 15 pennies a day is more than you would have earned in 2 weeks of field work before. But the smell, the mess. "Tell you what," the tanner says, reading your expression. "Try it for 3 days. If you hate it, I'll pay you for the time and no hard feelings." As you hesitate, a woman elbows her way through the crowd, heading straight for the tanner. "Master Fuller," she says, "I've come about the work." The tanner looks surprised. "You? But you're a woman?" "Yes," she interrupts. "And my husband was your best worker before he died. I helped him for years. I know the process as well as any man." Okay, so here's another massive social shift happening. Women entering trades that were previously male-dominated. With labour so scarce, gender barriers started crumbling in certain industries. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough that women found opportunities that would have been unthinkable before. The tanner scratches his chin. Ever actually done the heavy scraping? The lifting? "I've given birth to 4 children," she replies dryly. "I can handle lifting a hide." A few people in the crowd chuckle. The tanner shrugs. 15 pennies, same as anyone else. 20, she counters. The crowd goes silent. A woman negotiating wages like this? Unheard of. The tanner barks a laugh. 18 and not a penny more. "And you train this one too?" He jerks a thumb at you. "Done," she says without hesitation. And just like that, you've become an apprentice tanner with a woman as your teacher, being paid more than skilled craftsmen made before the plague. The old world truly was gone. As the crowd disperses, the messenger continues sharing news. Towns are offering citizenship to any skilled worker who will settle there. Landlords are reducing rents to keep tenants. Merchants who once dealt only in luxury goods for the wealthy are now selling to anyone with coin. You follow your new mentor back to the tannery, trying to ignore the smell that will soon become your daily reality. "I'm Agnes," she says over her shoulder. "Why tanning?" you ask. "You could probably do something less foul." Agnes slows to walk beside you. "My husband didn't die of the plague," she says quietly. 2 years ago, a cart crushed him, left me with 4 children and no income. Begged the tanner to let me work. He refused, said it wasn't woman's work. I took in washing instead, barely keeping us fed." She smiles grimly. "And now he needs me more than I need him. Funny how things change." This reveals another side of the post-plague economy. People who had been marginalised before, women, lower-class workers, even the disabled in some cases, suddenly found their skills valued, not out of charity or social progress, but out of sheer necessity. At the tannery, Agnes doesn't waste time. She throws you a stained apron and points to a pile of raw hides. "First step, scrape off all the flesh and fat," she demonstrates with a curved knife. "Too much left on, the hide rots. Too much taken off, the leather's weak. The work is disgusting. Within an hour you're covered in animal bits. Your arms ache and the smell has penetrated everything." But there's something strangely satisfying about the transformation, taking a raw, bloody hide and beginning its conversion into something useful. By midday, your stomach is growling despite the stench. Agnes calls a break, and you both rinse your hands in a bucket before sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese that the tanner provides. "He never fed workers before," Agnes comments, seeing your surprise. "Food costs are up 3-fold, and he knows we could walk away and find work elsewhere by sunset." This was part of the new reality. Employers had to offer not just higher wages, but better conditions to attract and keep workers. Some Italian cities even passed laws limiting how luxuriously workers could be treated, trying to prevent employer competition from driving up costs too much. "Where are you sleeping?" Agnes asks as you eat. You realise you haven't thought about it. Your family home is in the next village over. Walking back and forth each day would be possible but tiring. "He has a shed out back." Agnes nods toward a small structure. 2 workers used to share it. Now it's empty, not much, but it's shelter. After lunch, she shows you the next steps in the process, soaking the scraped hides in a mixture of water, lime, and urine. Yes, actual human urine collected in vats. Medieval tanning was not for the squeamish. "Everyone contributes," Agnes says with a straight face, pointing to a bucket in the corner of the shed. By evening, your body aches from unfamiliar labour, and you reek so badly you doubt you'll ever smell normal again. But as the tanner counts out your first day's wages, 18 small silver coins that glint in the fading light, you feel something unexpected: independence. Before the plague, your path would have been set. You'd have worked the same fields as your parents and grandparents, handed most of your harvest to the Lord, and lived or starved by forces beyond your control. Now, with those coins heavy in your palm, you have choices. You think of the silver goblet at the makeshift market. With a week's wages, you could buy such treasures for yourself. But then what? You can't eat silver, can't warm yourself with it. Instead, you walk back to the market as dusk falls and trade one of your precious coins for a thick candle, a small loaf of bread, and a piece of hard cheese. Practical things, survival things. In your borrowed shed that night, by candlelight, you eat better than you would have on a normal day before the plague. Tomorrow, you'll earn more coins, maybe save them, maybe trade for tools or clothes. The future is uncertain, but for perhaps the first time, it feels like your choice to make. As you drift towards sleep on a pile of straw that doesn't feel so different from your mattress back home, you realise something. In this strange new world where death has taken so much, it has also perversely given something back, a measure of freedom. Unlike your comfortable bedroom tonight, with its security and predictability, medieval survivors like you faced a world where all the old rules had suddenly changed. Terrifying, yes, but also filled with possibilities that would have been unimaginable just months before. And as the social fabric continued to unravel and re-knit itself in the coming months, those possibilities would only multiply, bringing both opportunity and conflict as Europe stumbled toward a new normal in the plague's devastating wake. 3 months into your new life as a tanner's apprentice, and the stink doesn't even bother you anymore. Agnes says that's how she knows you've become one of them. When you stop noticing the smell, everyone else still gives you a wide berth when you walk through the village though. It's better than perfume these days, Agnes jokes as you both scrape hides under the summer sun. Nobody wants to get close enough to give you the plague. She's not entirely wrong. People have developed strange ideas about how the disease spreads. Some believe it travels through bad smells, the miasma theory, while others are convinced it's carried in looks or breath. The stench of the tannery might be repulsive, but at least it keeps people at a distance. The tannery has been busy. With so many people dead, there are more cattle per survivor, which means more hides to process. Your hands have grown calloused, your arms stronger, and your coin purse heavier. Master Fuller, calls a voice from the road. A well-dressed man on horseback, clearly a merchant of some kind, approaches with a handkerchief held to his nose. The tanner straightens, wiping his hands on his apron. I need 50 good leather hides by month's end for saddles and harnesses. The king's requisitioned horses for his French campaign, and there's good money for those who can outfit them. 50? The tanner scratches his chin. That's a tall order. Got just 4 workers now. The merchant eyes you and Agnes. 4? You're counting the woman? Agnes straightens, knife in hand. I finished more hides last week than the 2 men combined. I've read accounts where women who stepped into traditionally male roles during the labour shortage faced exactly this kind of scepticism, but the economic reality eventually forced even the most traditional minds to adapt. The merchant looks doubtful, but turns back to Master Fuller. 50 hides, 6 shillings each. The tanner nearly chokes. 6? The price was 4 before the death. Take it or leave it. Every tanner for 20 miles is getting the same offer. After the merchant leaves, Master Fuller calls everyone together. 4 of you now. You, Agnes, a teenage boy who started last month, and a grey-haired man who'd been a farmer until his entire family died. We can do 50 hides in a month, the tanner says, but we'll need to work from sunrise to sunset. I'll pay you each 25 pennies a day. Agnes crosses her arms. 30. 28, he counters immediately. And Sundays off, adds the older man, for church. The tanner sighs. Fine, 28 pennies and Sundays free, but we start at dawn tomorrow. Once he walks away, Agnes nudges you. Before the plague, he'd have laughed at us for even suggesting higher wages. Now he bargains like we're equals. This was happening everywhere. A Suffolk landowner complained in his journal that workers become so rebellious that the master fears his servant more than the servant his master. Can you imagine how radical that shift must have felt to people who had lived their entire lives in a rigid hierarchy? By late summer of 1350, about 3 years after the plague first hit Europe, something remarkable was happening across the countryside. Peasants weren't just earning more, they were living better. You see it in your own life. With your wages, you've moved out of the shed into a small but solid cottage whose previous owners all died. You've bought a real bed with a stuffed mattress instead of sleeping on straw. Your meals include meat several times a week, something unheard of for common folk before. On your next free Sunday, you walk to the village church. The building seems too large now for the smaller congregation. The new priest, the third since the plague, the first 2 having died, is a young man with a nervous manner. He was rushed through his training to fill the desperate shortage of clergy. Brothers and sisters, he begins, his voice cracking slightly. Let us pray for those still suffering from God's great punishment. An old woman near the front stands up. If it's God's punishment, why did he take my innocent grandchildren and not sinners like the tax collector or the Lord's bailiff? They survived without a mark. The priest stammers, God's ways are mysterious. Mysterious, another voice calls out. Was it mysterious how the Jews poisoned the wells to spread the disease? This awful rumour had spread across Europe, leading to horrific persecution of Jewish communities. In some places, entire Jewish populations were murdered by mobs looking for someone to blame. There is no evidence of well poisoning, the priest says, with surprising firmness. The Pope himself has said as much. Then why did the plague spread along trade routes? Someone else demands. It followed where people travelled. This observation was actually quite astute. The disease did indeed follow human movement patterns, though not because of deliberate poisoning, but because the rats and fleas carrying the bacteria travelled with human cargo. After the service, people linger in small groups outside the church. You overhear snippets of conversation. The miller's charging triple what he did before. Can't get decent cloth anymore. All the best weavers died. My cousin's gone to London, says a craftsman can name his price there. The world has turned upside down. Things that were once cheap are now expensive. Jobs that were once scorned are now sought after. People who once had no options now have choices. You spot Agnes talking with several women and join their circle. Telling him I won't marry unless I can keep my job at the tannery, Agnes is saying, and my own wages. And what did he say to that? Asks a younger woman, eyes wide. He agreed. Agnes laughs. Can you imagine? Before the death, he'd have just found another woman. Now, she shrugs. Men need wives more than wives need husbands these days. It wasn't just economic power shifting. Social relationships were changing too. With so many widows and widowers, new marriages were forming with different expectations. Women who had proven they could support themselves weren't so quick to give up that independence. As you walk back from church, you pass the manor house where the Lord's son, now the Lord himself since his father's death was confirmed, is overseeing renovations. The windows are being enlarged, glass is being installed, even the nobility is living differently now. A group of labourers sitting in the shade, taking a break from the construction, wave you over. "Tanner," one calls out. "Come tell Martin here what you're earning these days." You hesitate, then share your daily wage. The workers whistle appreciatively. "See," the first man says to his companion, "and he's just an apprentice. I told you we should ask for more." "The Lord will never agree," Martin replies. "Then we all walk off the job," shrugs the first man. "See how fast his fancy windows get finished then." This collective bargaining power was unprecedented. Before, a lord might have had troublemakers flogged or worse. Now, workers were organising in ways that would eventually lead to the famous uprisings, like the 1381 Peasants' Revolt. The following week brings something new to your life. A visitor from a large town 20 miles away. "Master Fuller," the visitor addresses the tanner. "I represent the Tanners' Guild of St. Alban. We've heard of your operation here." The tanner frowns. "What of it? You're producing leather without guild oversight, without standardised quality." "Been tanning 30 years, Master Fuller spits. "My leather's better than half your guild's." "Nevertheless," the visitor continues, "the guild requires all tanners to be members, or to cease operation." Agnes whispers to you, "Before the plague, they'd have shut him down without a second thought. Guilds controlled everything." Master Fuller laughs. "And if I tell you to go back to your guild and kiss my arse?" The visitor's face reddens. "The guild has authority. Half your guild is dead," the tanner interrupts, "and I hear the rest can't keep up with demand. You need me more than I need you." The visitor changes tactics. "Join the guild and we'll ensure no one undercuts your prices. We set the rates for all members." "And the membership fee?" "Or normally £5, the visitor says, "but given the circumstances, we could reduce it to 2. Master Fuller considers this. £1, and I keep my current workers without them needing guild approval. They haggle a while longer before reaching an agreement." After the visitor leaves, you ask, "Why join at all? You said yourself they need you more than you need them." "For now," the tanner nods. "But times change. Better to have a say in the guild than fight it forever. Besides," he grins, "now we can charge guild prices." By autumn of 1350, another change becomes apparent. People are obsessed with avoiding disease. New daily rituals have emerged that would have seemed strange before the plague. You see it when trading in the village market. People hold fragrant herbs to their noses while shopping. They avoid touching hands when exchanging coins. Many wear small pouches of sweet-smelling herbs around their necks. Plague amulets, they're called. "It keeps away the bad air," explains a woman selling these pouches. "Rosemary, mint, lavender, and wormwood. Wear it at all times." You've noticed Agnes wearing one, though she seems embarrassed when you point it out. "Can't hurt," she mutters. "My neighbour swears they work. Her whole street died except for those with the herbs. Of course, this was pure coincidence. The herbs did nothing against the real cause of plague. But in a world without modern medicine, people desperately grabbed onto anything that seemed to offer protection." Other new habits have emerged too. People boil water before drinking it. They burn the clothing of the dead instead of reusing it. They quarantine newcomers to the village for days before allowing them to mix freely. Some of these practices, though based on flawed understanding, accidentally did help reduce disease transmission. Boiling water kills many pathogens. Burning contaminated clothing eliminates flea habitats. Quarantine can prevent contagion spread. Through tragic trial and error, medieval people were developing public health measures that actually worked. One evening, as you're finishing work, you notice smoke rising from the edge of the village. Following it, you find a group burning a huge pile of straw mattresses and old clothing. "Winter cleaning," explains an older woman overseeing the burning, "getting rid of anything that might harbour the pestilence before the cold drives us all indoors." Another unintended benefit, destroying flea habitats before winter, when people would crowd together in enclosed spaces, sharing warmth and, unfortunately, parasites. As winter approaches, you realise how much your life has changed in a single year, from a field worker bound to the land to an apprentice in a trade, from sleeping on straw in a crowded family hut to having your own cottage with a real bed, from near starvation to regular meals with meat. But there's something else too, a newfound respect. People who once would have ignored you now negotiate with you. Your opinion matters, your skills have value. You are no longer just another pair of hands in the field, interchangeable and disposable. One cold November evening, you're sitting in the village alehouse, another luxury you can now afford, when the newly installed bailiff enters. Before the plague, the bailiff was the Lord's enforcer, often feared and resented. This one looks barely older than you, thrust into the role by necessity. He calls for attention. The Lord requires 3 men to repair the mill before winter sets in. 6 days' work, 30 pennies per day. A few months ago, that would have been an astronomical wage. Now there's little reaction from the alehouse patrons. 35, calls out a man by the fire, and ale provided. The bailiff looks like he wants to argue, but just nods tiredly. Fine, who will take the work? 3 men eventually volunteer, but only after extracting promises about the exact hours and conditions. The bailiff leaves, looking defeated. "Saw the old lord turn a man's bones to jelly for talking back like that," comments an older patron after the bailiff leaves. "Now they're practically begging us to work." Agnes, who has joined you for a drink, leans in. "It won't last," she says quietly. "The nobles and merchants, they're not going to accept this new order forever. They'll find a way to push us back down." She's more right than she knows. Even as you enjoy your new status and comfort, forces are already working to restore the old hierarchies. In England, the first labour laws freezing wages will be enacted in 1351. In France, similar attempts to control labour costs are being implemented. But for now, in this strange window between the plague's devastation and the elite's reassertion of control, ordinary people are experiencing something rare: leverage. Later that night, returning to your cottage, you notice how different the village looks, not just because of the empty houses or the fewer people, but because of the improvements. Homes that once were simple wooden structures are being rebuilt with stone foundations. Windows that once were just openings covered with shutters now have oiled paper or even glass. People are using their new wealth to live better. Inside your own home, you light a candle. Beeswax, not tallow, another small luxury you can now afford. The mattress on your bed is stuffed with wool rather than straw. A copper pot hangs by the fire instead of a clay one. These material improvements might seem small from our modern perspective, but they represented significant quality of life changes. Better housing meant warmer, drier living conditions. Better bedding meant better sleep and fewer parasites. Better cooking implements meant more nutritious food preparation. All these improvements added up to something significant. People were living longer, not dramatically longer. Medieval life was still harsh by our standards, but the survivors of the plague who managed to avoid subsequent outbreaks often lived healthier lives than their pre-plague ancestors, simply because they had access to better nutrition and living conditions. As you drift towards sleep, you reflect on the strange paradox of your time. A world devastated by death, yet offering more opportunity for the living than ever before. Your wool-stuffed mattress is nothing compared to your comfortable modern bed, but compared to the straw pile you slept on a year ago, it feels like luxury. The next day will bring new challenges and opportunities as society continues to transform around you. The old world is gone, swept away by the plague's devastation. What replaces it is still forming, still malleable, and for the first time, people like you have a say in shaping it. Spring has arrived, bringing with it a strange tension to the village. It's been nearly 2 years since the plague swept through, and life has settled into new patterns. You've become skilled at tanning, earning wages that would have been unimaginable before. Agnes is now officially the tanner's wife, though she insisted on keeping her position and her own earnings. But something's shifting. You feel it first in small ways. Whispers in the marketplace, nervous glances when wages are discussed. Then one morning, the village crier arrives with a proclamation. Hear ye, hear ye, his voice carries across the village square. By order of our sovereign lord King Edward, the following laws are now in effect throughout England. A crowd gathers quickly. Royal proclamations aren't common events in small villages. All labourers, craftsmen and servants, the crier continues, reading from a scroll, shall accept the same wages and terms as were paid in the year 1346, before the great mortality. A murmur ripples through the crowd. 1346 wages, that's less than half what most people are earning now. Furthermore, the crier raises his voice over the growing noise. It shall be illegal for any able-bodied man or woman to refuse suitable work when offered. Those violating these laws shall be fined or imprisoned. The crowd erupts. Someone throws a turnip at the crier, who ducks and continues reading even louder. These laws are enacted for the common good, to prevent the realm from falling into ruin due to excessive wages and idle hands. What you're witnessing is the Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351. It was a direct response by the ruling class to the economic changes we've been following. Landowners, nobles, and wealthy merchants were horrified by rising wages and workers' new mobility. This law was their attempt to turn back the clock to before the plague. As the crier finishes and hurries away, the village explodes in angry conversation. They can't enforce this, a carpenter declares. Who's going to make me work for half my worth? The king's sheriffs, you idiot, replies a woman clutching a basket, and they'll throw you in a cell if you refuse. Master Fuller pushes through the crowd toward you and Agnes. His face is thunderous. Back to the tannery, now. Once you're back at the workshop, away from prying ears, he paces in agitation. This is bad, very bad. You're not actually going to cut our wages, are you? Agnes asks directly. The tanner runs a hand through his thinning hair. Not if I can help it, but they've appointed enforcers in every county. They'll be checking guild records, questioning workers. So what do? You ask. He thinks for a moment. On paper, you'll be paid the old wage rates, but... He lowers his voice, though there's no one else around. I can provide your meals. A cart of firewood might appear by your cottage each week. A winter coat might be a gift, not payment. This kind of under-the-table compensation became common. Employers who valued their workers found ways around the wage freezes. Some provided housing, food, or goods in addition to the mandated lower wages. Others simply ignored the law when they could get away with it. But the authorities were serious about enforcement. 2 weeks later, you see that seriousness firsthand. The weekly market is interrupted by the arrival of the sheriff and 4 armed men. They drag a stonemason into the square and force him to his knees. This man, announces the sheriff, demanded 3 pennies per day for his labour on the church repairs. When the legal rate is 1.5, he has been found guilty of violating the statute of labourers. The crowd watches in uneasy silence as the sheriff continues. The penalty is 3 days in the stocks and a fine of 20 shillings. The mason is forced into the wooden stocks at the edge of the square, his head and hands locked into the uncomfortable restraints where he'll remain exposed to the elements and public humiliation. Let this be a warning, the sheriff calls out. The king's law will be enforced. That evening, under cover of darkness, villagers secretly bring water and food to the mason. One person even holds a cloak over him during a brief rainfall. Small acts of solidarity, but meaningful. When the sheriff's men aren't around, people discuss the situation openly. The nobles are terrified, explains an old merchant who travels between villages. They've lived their whole lives with peasants under their thumb. Now that we have some leverage, they're using the king's power to crush us. Can they really turn everything back to how it was before? Someone asks. The merchant snorts. They can try, but there are fewer workers now, and that's a fact they can't change with any law. He's right. The fundamental economic reality, a drastically reduced workforce, couldn't be erased by legislation, but the ruling class had centuries of experience maintaining control, and they were using every tool at their disposal. A month after the proclamation, the tanner calls everyone together again. The guild has been ordered to keep detailed records of all workers and their wages, he explains grimly. Inspections will be random. Anyone found receiving extra compensation will be fined, along with their employer. So our arrangement, you begin, has to stop, he finishes, looking genuinely regretful. They're watching too closely now. Just like that, your income is cut in half. The comfortable life you've built begins to crumble at the edges. The small luxuries go first. No more meat with every meal, no more fine candles. Then larger sacrifices follow. You have to give up the cottage you were renting and move back to the tanner's shed to save money. You're not alone in these reversals. Across the village, people who had begun to improve their circumstances find themselves pushed back down. The brief window of opportunity seems to be closing, but humans are remarkably adaptable, especially when motivated by self-interest. New forms of resistance emerge. Need a hand with that garden? Asks a farmer's widow one evening as you're struggling to dig a small plot behind the tannery shed. I can't pay you, you admit. Didn't offer it for coin, she replies, but I've got more turnips than I can eat, and that leather vest you're making looks about my size. Bartering becomes the new currency, direct exchanges of goods and services that bypass the regulated wage system. It's technically against the spirit of the law, but harder to track and punish than straightforward wage violations. Other forms of resistance are less subtle. Work slowdowns become common. If you're being paid half what you're worth, why work at full speed? Taking your time with those hides, Agnes observes one afternoon as you methodically scrape at a pace that would have earned you a scolding months ago. Worth half the pay, half the effort, you reply. She glances around to ensure no one's listening. Just be careful. The master's under pressure from the guild. They've started finding workshops that don't meet quotas. This pressure creates tension between workers and employers, both of whom are caught in a system neither created. Master Fuller, once reasonably fair in his dealings, grows snappish and demanding as guild expectations increase while his workforce's motivation decreases. "I could have you replaced," he threatens after finding you taking an unauthorized break. "With who?" you challenge, knowing that even with reduced wages, workers are still scarce. Good luck finding someone who knows how to prepare the lime pits properly. It's a dangerous game of chicken. You need the work, however poorly paid. He needs your skills, which would take months to replace. Neither can afford to break completely with the other. The situation in cities is even more volatile. When a travelling peddler visits the village, he brings news from London. The guilds there have hired thugs to intimidate workers, he tells the crowd at the alehouse. Anyone suspected of accepting higher than legal wages gets a midnight visit. Men have been beaten, workshops vandalised. And how are people responding? Someone asks. The peddler leans in. Workers are organising too. Secret meetings, codes to identify each other. Some talk of revolt, though that's dangerous talk. He taps his nose meaningfully. The walls have ears these days. Indeed, another development of this period was the rise of informants. Authorities offered rewards for reporting wage violations or worker organisations. Neighbours informed on neighbours, creating an atmosphere of suspicion. One morning, you arrive at the tannery to find Agnes looking pale and worried. "Martin was arrested last night," she says quietly. Martin, the older man who worked alongside you, had become something of a mentor. "What for?" you ask, though you can guess. "Sheriff said he was organising workers, planning to demand higher wages again." She rubs her arms nervously. "They said he'll be made an example." 2 days later, that example is made public. Martin is brought to the village square, his hands bound. The sheriff reads the charges: incitement, conspiracy to violate the labour statutes, insubordination. The punishment is severe: public branding on the face with an F for false, meaning oathbreaker, followed by imprisonment. As they heat the branding iron, the crowd grows restless. There are mutterings, angry glances. For a moment it seems like they might intervene. The sheriff senses it too and calls his men into a tighter formation around the prisoner. The tension builds until one of the wealthier villagers, a merchant who's benefited from lower wages for his workers, steps forward. "If I pay his fine, will you spare the brand and jail?" he offers. The sheriff considers, then nods curtly. Money changes hands, and Martin is released with just a warning. The crowd disperses, crisis averted for the moment. Later, you ask the merchant why he intervened. "Don't mistake me for some champion of workers," he replies frankly, "but a branded imprisoned man produces nothing and buys nothing. Bad for business, and a riot would be even worse." It's a coldly practical answer, but it illustrates something important. The economy still needed to function. Even with the restrictive laws, there was a limit to how far authorities could push before the system itself would break down. This uneasy balance continued through 1351 and 1352. The law